The crisp autumn air wrapped around Harvard University's historic campus, where students bustled between ivy-clad buildings, their conversations filled with political discourse, academic ambition, and the latest controversies sweeping the nation. Inside one of the grand lecture halls, Professor Samuel Whitmore, renowned for his impassioned liberal views and his sharp critiques of conservative figures, prepared for his guest lecture. Today's topic, the role of media and government, propaganda or truth. The audience was packed with eager students, activists, and local media eager to witness another of Whitmore's fiery debates. Some were excited, others skeptical, but few had anticipated the presence of a surprise guest, one who would change the entire course of the discussion. At precisely 3 p.m., the doors at the back of the lecture hall swung open, and in walked Karoline Leavitt, the White House press secretary under President Donald Trump. Dressed in a sharp navy blue blazer, her confidence radiated as she strode to an open seat near the front. The murmurs in the room intensified. Leavitt was no stranger to controversy. As the first Gen Z press secretary and a fierce defender of conservative values, she had made headlines for her unapologetic stance on free speech, the media's role in shaping public perception, and her firm support of the administration she served. Professor Whitmore, catching sight of her, arched an eyebrow. A smirk tugged at the corners of his lips. He tapped the microphone twice, clearing his throat. Well, he began, his voice dripping with amusement. Looks like we have a special guest in the house. Miss Leavitt, how gracious of you to join us. A ripple of laughter ran through the audience, but Karoline simply smiled. She had been in these situations before. She knew the game and she played it well. Thank you, Professor Whitmore, she said, her voice steady. I wouldn't miss the opportunity to hear your take on government and media. I hope we can have an open discussion. Whitmore leaned forward. Oh, I certainly hope so. But fair warning, I don't sugarcoat things. Another chuckle from the audience. Karoline nodded. I wouldn't expect you to. The debate was about to begin. The question was, who would come out on top? Professor Whitmore adjusted his glasses and turned to the class with a theatrical sigh. Since we have the pleasure of Miss Leavitt's presence, why don't we discuss the Trump administration's relationship with the media? Surely, as the press secretary, you must have some fascinating insights. The students chuckled again, sensing the tension brewing in the air. Karoline crossed her legs, unfazed. I'd be happy to, Professor. But let's make sure we discuss facts, not just opinions. Whitmore smirked. Oh, facts? That's rich. Coming from an administration that labels every unfavorable report as fake news. He turned to the class. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the modern conservative playbook. Discredit the press, control the narrative, and attack the truth. Some students clapped, while others exchanged wary glances. Karoline remained calm. Professor, let me ask you something, she said smoothly. Do you believe the media in this country is completely neutral and unbiased? Whitmore scoffed. Of course not. But that doesn't mean the media is the enemy of the people, as your boss so famously puts it. Karoline leaned forward. The press is supposed to inform the public, not manipulate them. And yet, we've seen mainstream media outlets peddle false narratives. Russia collusion, Hunter Biden's laptop being Russian disinformation, and let's not forget the endless Trump is a dictator headlines. She glanced at the crowd. Would you call that honest journalism? A few murmurs of agreement could be heard, but Whitmore wasn't backing down. So, let me get this straight. You're saying conservative outlets like Fox News are the beacon of truth? He challenged. Karoline smiled. I'm saying that every news outlet has a bias, including conservative ones. But the difference is liberal media pretends they don't. They act as if they are the ultimate arbiters of truth, when in reality, they push narratives that align with their ideology. The professor narrowed his eyes. Tell me, Miss Leavitt, do you honestly believe that the Trump administration has been transparent with the American people? Karoline met his gaze without hesitation. Absolutely. President Trump has been one of the most accessible presidents in modern history. He doesn't hide behind scripted teleprompter speeches or dodge tough questions. He faces the press head-on, no matter how hostile they are. Can the same be said for the current administration? The room fell silent. The students were watching a real-time battle of wits, and many were impressed by how Karoline held her ground. Professor Whitmore, however, wasn't ready to concede. He chuckled dryly. Miss Leavitt, I must say, you're quite skilled at dodging the point. He turned to the class. You see, ladies and gentlemen, this is why conservatives are so effective. They don't engage with reality, they redefine it. Karoline's expression didn't waver. And yet, Professor, here I am, engaging with you directly. If I were avoiding reality, I wouldn't be sitting in this chair right now, would I? A few students nodded in agreement. The tide was shifting. Whitmore folded his arms. Fine. Let's talk about reality. Let's talk about January 6th. The moment he said it, the room tensed. The debate was about to get even more intense. A hush fell over the lecture hall as Professor Whitmore leaned forward, eyes gleaming. He had just played what he believed to be his trump card. January 6th, he repeated, savoring the weight of the words. The so-called patriots who stormed the Capitol, vandalized the halls of democracy, and threatened lawmakers, all because they refused to accept the results of a free and fair election. And here you are, Miss Leavitt, proudly serving the very administration that enabled and encouraged that attack. The murmurs among students grew louder. Some nodded in agreement with Whitmore, while others turned toward Karoline, curious about how she would respond. But she didn't flinch. Karoline clasped her hands together and took a measured breath before speaking. Professor, I appreciate your passion, but let's be clear about something. January 6th was not a government-sanctioned event. It was an unlawful riot that President Trump himself condemned. He urged people to peacefully and patriotically make their voices heard. Those are his exact words. Whitmore rolled his eyes. Oh, come on. Are we really playing semantics here? He fanned the flames for months with baseless election fraud claims. He didn't send in the National Guard. He let it happen. Karoline's lips pressed into a thin line. Actually, that's false. President Trump authorized 10,000 National Guard troops days before the event, but Democratic leaders in D.C. didn't accept them. Why? Because they didn't want the optics of military presence. She scanned the room. But let's set that aside for a moment. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that Trump's rhetoric played a role in that day. If we're going to hold leaders accountable for riots, then where is the outrage over the summer of 2020? Whitmore's smirk faltered slightly. Karoline continued, her voice firm. For months, America watched as cities burned. Small businesses were destroyed, police stations were set on fire, and people lost their lives. And yet, what did many in the media call it? Mostly peaceful protests. She looked directly at the professor. Did you condemn those riots as forcefully as you condemn January 6th? A few students gasped. Others exchanged glances, intrigued by the shift in power. Whitmore scoffed, but his voice lacked the same confident edge. That's a false equivalence. Karoline raised an eyebrow. Is it? Both were instances of political violence. Both involved destruction, but only one gets labeled as a threat to democracy. Why is that, Professor? Silence. A hand shot up from the audience. A young man in a Harvard sweatshirt spoke. She has a point. I remember seeing CNN call the riots in Minneapolis mostly peaceful, while a building was literally on fire in the background. Others nodded. A few clapped. Whitmore's frustration became visible. Miss Leavitt, let's not pretend that your administration values democracy. President Trump and his allies tried to overturn an election. Karoline shook her head. Challenging election results is not an attack on democracy. Democrats have done it for years. They objected to Bush's victories in 2000 and 2004. Hillary Clinton called Trump illegitimate for 4 years. Stacey Abrams still won't concede her governor's race in Georgia. So tell me, Professor, why is it defending democracy when the left challenges an election but undermining democracy when the right does? Whitmore opened his mouth but hesitated. The students were no longer just spectators, they were thinking. Karoline smiled. I think it's time we have a real conversation about political double standards. The tide of the debate had shifted, and for the first time, Professor Whitmore seemed unsure of how to proceed. Professor Whitmore's confidence wavered, but he wasn't ready to surrender. He had spent decades molding young minds, reinforcing progressive ideals, and challenging what he saw as dangerous conservative rhetoric. But Karoline Leavitt was proving to be an opponent unlike any other, calm, prepared, and unwilling to be steamrolled by ideological grandstanding. He exhaled sharply and adjusted his tie. "Miss Leavitt," he said, regaining his composure, "let's talk about something even more fundamental than January 6th. Let's talk about democracy itself." Karoline tilted her head. "Go on." Whitmore leaned forward, his voice taking on a measured, almost professorial tone. "The Trump administration has consistently attacked the institutions that hold this country together: journalism, education, and yes, even elections. Your party talks about freedom of speech, but let's be honest. You only support it when it benefits you. When students want to discuss topics like systemic racism, gender identity, or critical race theory, conservatives call it indoctrination and try to ban it. Is that free speech?" A wave of applause rippled through the students. This was familiar territory for them, attacking conservatives for being anti-education. Whitmore allowed himself a small smile, believing he had regained control of the discussion. But Karoline wasn't rattled. She clasped her hands together and responded smoothly. "Professor, I find it fascinating that you talk about free speech while simultaneously defending the very institutions that suppress it." Whitmore frowned. "Suppress it?" Karoline nodded. "Yes, universities across this country claim to value open discussion, but the moment a conservative speaker is invited to campus, they're met with protests, cancellations, or even physical threats. Take Riley Gaines, who was harassed and assaulted for defending women's sports. Take Ben Shapiro, who needs security just to give a speech." She glanced around the room, making eye contact with the students. "How many of you feel comfortable openly expressing a conservative opinion in your classes?" A few hesitant hands went up. Most students remained still, exchanging uneasy glances. Karoline continued, "This isn't about banning discussions on race or gender. This is about ensuring that students with different viewpoints, conservative viewpoints, aren't shamed, silenced, or punished for speaking up." Whitmore shook his head. "That's nonsense. Conservatives have more media power than ever. You have Fox News, talk radio, and social media influencers spreading your ideas 24/7. Karoline smiled knowingly. "Oh, you mean the same social media platforms that banned a sitting U.S. president? The same platforms that suppressed the Hunter Biden laptop story before an election? The same platforms that labeled dissenting opinions on COVID as misinformation and silenced scientists who didn't align with government narratives?" More murmurs spread through the crowd. A few students who had been skeptical of Karoline now leaned forward, intrigued. Whitmore's jaw tightened. He had intended to put Karoline on the defensive, but she was systematically dismantling his arguments. Karoline softened her tone. "Look, I'm not saying conservatives are victims. We're not. But let's stop pretending that the left isn't wielding institutional power to control the narrative. Whether it's the media, big tech, or academia, there's a clear imbalance. And that's not healthy for democracy." Silence. Finally, a female student in the front row raised her hand. "Professor Whitmore," she said hesitantly, "I'm a Democrat and I don't support Trump, but I think she's making some fair points. Aren't universities supposed to encourage all viewpoints?" A few more students nodded. The debate wasn't just between Whitmore and Karoline anymore. It was shifting to the students themselves. Whitmore exhaled through his nose, realizing he was losing control of the room. Karoline smiled. "I believe in free speech for everyone, Professor, even for those who disagree with me." And with that, the debate took a turn no one had expected. The air in the lecture hall was thick with tension, but Karoline remained poised. The murmurs among students had transformed into open discussion, a clear sign that she had struck a chord. Professor Whitmore, however, was not ready to admit defeat. He straightened his posture and gave Karoline a pointed look. Well, Miss Leavitt, since you're such a champion of free speech, let's see how you handle this. Do you deny that Trump and his administration fostered division in this country? That his rhetoric emboldened white supremacy and tore at the fabric of American unity? Some students clapped at his words, expecting this to be the final blow. But Karoline simply exhaled, her expression unreadable. She nodded slowly. Division exists in this country, Professor. But let's be honest about where it comes from. It's easy to blame President Trump because that's what the media has conditioned people to do. But division didn't start in 2016. It didn't even start with politics. It started when we stopped seeing each other as Americans first and started defining each other by race, gender, and ideology. She scanned the room, locking eyes with students who had remained silent throughout the debate. Think about it. Who tells you that America is fundamentally racist? That you should feel guilty for things you didn't do? That you should see each other as oppressors and victims instead of equals? Who benefits from that mindset? A hush fell over the room. Some students looked down, deep in thought. Others shifted uncomfortably. Karoline leaned forward. And as for the Trump-emboldened white supremacy claim, let's set the record straight. In 2017, after Charlottesville, Trump specifically condemned white supremacy. The media twisted his words. He denounced the KKK and neo-Nazis repeatedly, but that wasn't enough because the narrative had already been written. And yet, when Joe Biden delivered a eulogy for a former KKK leader, the media said nothing. Whitmore's mouth tightened. He hadn't expected her to come so well prepared. Karoline softened her voice but remained firm. Professor, I respect your passion. But I refuse to accept the idea that love for my country or belief in free speech makes me an extremist. We may have different political beliefs, but at the end of the day, I believe most Americans, Republican or Democrat, want the same thing. A country where they can speak freely, work hard, and build a future for their families. The room was silent. No clapping, no interruptions. Just quiet contemplation. And then, a single student started clapping. Then another, and another. Soon, nearly half the room was applauding. Even students who had initially laughed at her were nodding in respect. Professor Whitmore exhaled sharply, realizing he had lost the room. He forced a thin smile. Well, Miss Leavitt, I must admit you're a formidable debater. I suppose that's why you're the White House press secretary. Karoline smiled. And I suppose that's why you're a professor, sir. Debate is important. I only wish it happened more often, without fear of backlash. Whitmore gave a stiff nod and turned to the class. That's all for today. As the students filed out, many approached Karoline, some to shake her hand, others to ask more questions. Even those who disagreed with her seemed to respect her courage and composure. As Karoline gathered her things, a young woman hesitated before speaking. I'm not conservative, but thank you. I've never seen anyone push back like that before. You made me think. Karoline smiled. That's all I ask. And with that, she walked out of the hall, having not just won a debate, but having planted a seed. A seed that, for some, might just grow into a new way of thinking.